Okay, so we continue with our read aloud of what was the Underground Railroad. Last time we read chapters 1 and 2 and we learned how slaves got here and how they were treated. Let's continue. We're going on to chapter 3, Abolition. At one point, slavery existed in every part of the United States, even the North. In fact, founding father Benjamin Franklin owned a few slaves for many years until he came to see slavery as evil. All the 13 original colonies allowed slavery. However, by 1804, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey had all passed laws to end slavery, though there were still enslaved people living in the North as late as 1840. When the Northwest Territory was created in 1787, slavery was not allowed there, so all the states created from that territory were free states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. In addition, Iowa, Maine, California, Oregon, and Kansas were all admitted before the Civil War as free states. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, there were 19 free states and 15 slave states. There were also 8 free territories, which were areas not yet officially made states. Why was it so different in the North? People living there didn't need large numbers of farm workers the way people in the South did. Most farms in the North were small because the land wasn't very good for growing crops. More and more people became shopkeepers, craftsmen, factory workers, and merchants. From the moment the United States was born, there were people who believed that slavery was just plain wrong. Some could accept slavery ending slowly over time, but some people wanted to end or abolish slavery right away. These people were called abolitionists. Which presidents owned slaves? 12 U.S. presidents owned slaves. Here are the ones who did. 8 of them owned slaves while in office. So we have Zachary Taylor, John Tyler, James Madison, James K. Polk, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson. Right here in the crease, you can't really see him, is James Monroe. Over here is George Washington, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Martin Van Buren, and William Henry Harrison. These are the 4 that owned slaves at some point in their lives. But these all owned them while they were president too. William Lloyd Garrison was a leader in the American abolitionist movement. Garrison, who was poor and white, came from Massachusetts. He first worked as a printer and then went on to become a writer and editor. In 1831, he published the first issue of a newspaper called The Liberator. In its pages, he called for an immediate end to slavery. Garrison was known and admired for his firm beliefs and his fiery way of expressing them. With Arthur Tappan and others, Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. The society was started in 1833. By 1838, it had 1,350 local chapters and 250,000 members. Some were former slaves such as Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. They gave speeches to bring other people to their cause. The headquarters of the society was in New York City, and from 1840 to 1870, it published a weekly newspaper. It was called the National Anti-Slavery Standard. Many abolitionists in the United States were Quakers. Started in England in 1648, the Quakers were a Christian group who believed that people should tremble at the word of the Lord. That's where the name Quakers came from. Quakers wore plain clothes and led simple lives. They did not own many things. There are still Quakers today. They worship in Quaker meeting houses without ministers. Instead, each member of the group is allowed to speak. Equality is an important part of the Quaker religion. For that reason, Quakers like John Woolman from New Jersey and Thomas Garrett from Pennsylvania were early outspoken critics of slavery. Slavery did not end for good until 1865 at the end of the Civil War. Up until then, many abolitionists took part in the Underground Railroad. Some became conductors who helped runaway slaves escape. Their homes, stores, stables, and barns were used as safe stations on the Underground Railroad, places where slaves could hide. John Fairfield, who was from a slaveholding family, became a famous conductor. Unlike the peace-loving Quakers, Fairfield carried a gun. He helped hundreds of slaves escape, often by pretending to be a slave owner himself. Even though they put themselves at risk, the conductors on the Underground Railroad did so to help people who were not free. Chapter 4: A Path to Freedom. In the 1820s, a white man named John Rankin moved from the slave state of Tennessee to the free state of Ohio. He bought a house in a town on the Ohio River. Every night, John Rankin raised a lantern to the top of a pole in his front yard. Why did he keep doing this? Slaves freeing from Tennessee had to cross the Ohio River, and John Rankin wanted to help them. The lantern showed the way to the river. The lantern was a beacon and a guide. It also was a sign that Rankin's home was a safe house. Slaves could stop there and get food, shelter, and clothing before heading off again. John Rankin became famous for helping slaves escape. Plantation owners were furious with him. Some came across the river and attacked his house. They even tried to set it on fire, but that did not stop Rankin. He continued to help runaways until slavery was finally outlawed. Around the same time, a Quaker named Levi Coffin lived in Newport, Indiana. Indiana was a free state that shared a border with Kentucky, a slave state. Even in Indiana, however, many people didn't see anything wrong with slavery. Coffin and his wife Catherine, however, hated slavery. If they could help slaves fleeing from Kentucky, of course they would. Not only did the Coffins feed and clothe the runaways, sometimes Levi Coffin took them to a house farther north. Coffin had a special wagon with a secret compartment in the bottom. This compartment could hide one or two people. Sometimes he hid them under bales of hay or in boxes. In the early 1820s, most people like John Rankin and the Coffins worked alone. They were not part of any group, but by around 1830, abolitionists began to see themselves as part of a team. They began to work together. A new language was developed. They called their homes or other stopping places stations. They called themselves station masters, conductors, or operators. Travel routes were called lines, and they called the escaping slaves cargo or passengers on this unusual train to freedom. News of the railroad spread south. Slaves who made it to freedom in the North might become conductors. Free blacks living in the North became conductors too. All these people helped the Underground Railroad to grow. By the 1840s, there was a system in place. But because it was a secret, no records were kept. Even today, we don't know exactly how the Underground Railroad operated. We do know that networks were set up in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and the states in New England. Slaves escaping from Gulf states such as Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama typically went north to Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Slaves from the East Coast usually went to Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and Maine. Slaves in Texas went in the opposite direction, south to Mexico. Mexico was a country where slavery was illegal. Routes to freedom. So here's this map. Slaves took many routes to freedom. Those who lived in North Carolina or Virginia tried to get to New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, or even Canada. Those from Mississippi went to Cleveland, Detroit, or Chicago. Not all slaves went north. Slaves in Georgia might escape to the Everglades, Cuba, Jamaica, or Haiti. Often slaves picked winter around Christmas to escape. They had time off for the holiday, so it might take several days before they were missed. Also, in winter, the Ohio River would be frozen and easier to get across. Escape routes often involved crossing the Ohio River. Slaves found secret ways to let their friends know of their plans to escape. They often sang while they worked in the fields. Their overseers did not pay attention to the words of the songs. One song, called "Let My People Go," let others know that the singer was about to run away. Slaves used hollowed-out gourds as water dippers, but a drinking gourd was also a code word for the Big Dipper, the constellation that points to the North Star. Runaway slaves needed to follow the North Star to escape to freedom. So following the drinking gourd was a phrase that also meant slaves were going to try and run away. Slave owners didn't like to talk about the North. They didn't want slaves to know they could find a better life there. Often masters made up lies. They said black people were treated terribly up north, worse than on plantations. That did not keep slaves from running away. Slave owners also said it was too cold to live in Canada. One male slave said, "We knew Canada was a good country for us because master was so anxious that we not go there." On their journey to freedom, slaves took nothing with them, just themselves. They had to stay on the run even when they did not know where their next stop would lead them. Because most slaves didn't know how to read, many didn't even understand where exactly the North was or how to get there. The only thing they knew was that North meant no slavery, and that was enough. On the road, slaves looked out for lanterns or quilts hung over the porches. A colorful quilt displayed outdoors might be another sign of a safe house. Because of all the time spent in hiding, it might take slaves weeks or months to travel a short distance that normally took only a few days. They had to survive on very little sleep and food. Worst of all was the fear. Here is how a runaway slave named Josiah Henson described it. "A fearful dread of detection ever pursued me. I would start out of my sleep in terror, my heart beating against my ribs, and expecting to find dogs and slave hunters after me." Henson was right to be afraid. Runaway slaves were hunted down and often captured. Bloodhounds sniffed out runaways who were still in nearby woods or swamps. For slaves who managed to get farther away, a plantation owner might hire a slave catcher. These men earned money by capturing escaped slaves and returning them to their masters. They patrolled docks and train stations looking for runaways. Slave catchers. From Georgia all the way up to Michigan, slave catchers combed roads, docks, and city streets looking for escaped slaves. Many took along trained bloodhounds. Sometimes a slave catcher would arrest the wrong person, such as a free black man or woman. The slave catcher did not care. He just wanted to collect a reward. Slave catchers might earn as much as $600 a year hunting down escaped slaves. That was a lot of money back then. If caught, an escaped slave would be severely punished. When a slave named George Tinsley tried to escape, he was chased by dogs that tore off his clothes and bit him. Then he was put in the pillory, a big piece of timber with a hole for his head, and whipped. Conductors on the Underground Railroad were punished too. In 1848, Thomas Garrett, we'll look at these pictures in a little bit, as soon as we get to read about Thomas Garrett, was fined about $5,400 for hiding escaping slaves in Wilmington, Delaware. That was a lot of money back then. Garrett lost his home and nearly everything else too. In 1844, a sea captain named Jonathan Walker was caught helping 8 slaves escape by boat from Pensacola, Florida. A red-hot iron was pressed into Walker's palm. He was branded with the letters SS for slave stealer. Samuel A. Smith, a white man who helped 3 slaves escape from Virginia, was sent to jail for 8 years. In the free states, anyone caught helping or harboring a runaway slave could be fined $1,000. Despite the many dangers for both passengers and conductors, as many as 2,500 slaves a year rode to freedom between 1830 and 1860. The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was a former slave named Harriet Tubman. She was so brave and heroic that she deserves a chapter of her own. And we'll read that next time. But let's go back and look at the pictures. So here is a map of Underground Railroad routes through Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. So here's Ohio. There's the line. Here's Kentucky down here. And this is Indiana. And up here is Michigan. And so these dark lines right here, these are the different routes. And all those little white circles are the stops. So there's lots of people that were willing to help and that were risking their lives to help. Here's Ohio abolitionists John and Jane Rankin. That's an actual picture of them. Here's a wood engraving depicting a slave auction in Richmond, Virginia. And this is a receipt from 1840 for a $250 payment for a male slave. This is slave quarters at the Hermitage Plantation outside of Savannah, Georgia. You can see it wasn't a fancy house and it wasn't really very nice. This is a poster advertising an anti-slave catchers convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on April 13th, 1854. Here's a caution sign, an 1851 poster warning African Americans about the fugitive slave law. Then this picture right here is a photo featuring 5 generations of a slave family on a plantation in Beaufort, South Carolina. So, around the time of the Civil War, technology developed and we had cameras and we could take pictures. This is when cameras were invented. And so these are actual people, these are actual slaves, and this is a real picture of them. A 1910 photo of Uncle Billy Marshall, an African-American conductor on the Underground Railroad from Ripley, Ohio. This is a portrait of Ellen Craft wearing the disguise she used to escape from slavery. And this is an image circa 1875 to 1880 of African American workers amid bales of cotton. This is a 19th century painting that shows African Americans escaping from slavery. This is a picture of Harriet Tubman. It says Nurse, Spy, and Scout, 1823 to 1913. Up here, this is Sojourner Truth, a former slave and abolitionist leader in 1864. This is a picture of Frederick Douglass in 1856. And down here, emancipated slaves working for the U.S. Army in Virginia. So emancipated means that they were freed. This is the title page of the first edition of Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is an oil portrait from 1855 of William Lloyd Garrison, founding editor of the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Over here is a copy of The Liberator dated December 21st, 1833. Over here is a lithograph from 1850 depicting Frederick Douglass and others as they watch Henry Box Brown emerging from a crate. Here is a picture of Caroline Quarles Watkins when she lived in Sandwich, Ontario. And a picture of Underground Railroad operator George P. Clark. This is a reward poster in 1847 in St. Louis, Missouri for the capture of 5 slaves. The raising of a lantern on the flagpole in Ripley, Ohio, used to signal to fugitive slaves. Over here, Thomas L. Gray in front of his house in Beavertown, Ohio, which served as a station on the Underground Railroad. And this is the McGee House in Canisteo, New York, which was an Underground Railroad station. Wood engraving depicting African Americans in Washington, D.C. on April 19, 1866, celebrating the end of slavery. And down here, a photo from 1863 of slaves who found freedom in the North. And next time we will read Chapter 5, The Great Conductor.